Have you ever made a decision in a moment of desperation that changed the entire trajectory of your life? A choice that seemed so small, so insignificant in the moment, yet rippled through decades like stones thrown into still water? Picture this. You're exhausted, famished, your body crying out for immediate relief. Someone offers you exactly what you need right now, but the price is everything you've been promised for tomorrow. Most of us would like to think we'd choose wisely. Most of us would be wrong. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most fascinating and tragic figures in biblical history, a man whose name has become synonymous with poor choices and lost opportunities. But his story is so much more than a cautionary tale about a bowl of stew. It's a journey through the complexities of family dynamics, the weight of destiny, the power of forgiveness, and ultimately, the redemption that can emerge from our greatest failures. This is the story of Esau, the firstborn who traded his future for a meal, the hunter who became the hunted, the brother who lost everything only to discover something far more valuable in the end. His journey will take us from the tents of Isaac through the wilderness of regret, into the mountains of Edom, and finally to a moment of reconciliation that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice, mercy, and the mysterious ways that divine providence works through human failure. So settle in, because we're about to explore a story that's been captivating audiences for over 3 millennia. A story that might just change how you view your own choices, your own family relationships, and your own capacity for both devastating mistakes and incredible grace. To understand Esau's story, we need to step back into the ancient world of the patriarchs, into a time when family meant everything, and the blessing of the firstborn could determine the fate of nations. We're in the land of Canaan, somewhere around 2000 BCE, in a world where shepherds and hunters moved across vast landscapes under star-filled skies that seemed close enough to touch. Isaac and Rebekah's love story had been one for the ages, a divinely orchestrated romance that began with a servant's prayer and a young woman's kindness at a well. But now 20 years into their marriage, their joy was tempered by a familiar pain childlessness. In a culture where children, especially sons, were seen as the ultimate blessing and security for old age, Rebekah's barren womb felt like a divine judgment. But Isaac was a man of prayer, just like his father Abraham had been. Day after day he interceded for his beloved wife, pleading with the God who had promised to make his descendants as numerous as the stars. And finally, after 2 decades of waiting prayers and tears, Rebekah conceived. But this was no ordinary pregnancy. From the very beginning, something extraordinary and troubling was happening within her womb. The babies weren't just active, they were at war. The Hebrew text uses a word that suggests violent struggling, as if 2 opposing forces were already locked in an eternal conflict even before they drew their first breath. Rebekah was bewildered and distressed. This wasn't the peaceful, joyous pregnancy she had dreamed of during those long years of waiting. Instead, she found herself caught in the middle of what felt like an ancient battle being fought within her own body. Finally, in her desperation and confusion, she did what any woman of faith would do. She sought the Lord. The answer she received was both illuminating and ominous. It was a prophecy that would echo through generations, shaping the destiny of 2 nations, and explaining the conflict that had already begun in her womb. Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. Think about the weight of those words. Rebekah wasn't just carrying twins, she was carrying the founders of two distinct peoples, two different ways of life, two separate destinies, and in a culture where birth order determined everything, inheritance, authority, family leadership, the revelation that the older would serve the younger was nothing short of revolutionary. When the time finally came for delivery, the prophecy began to unfold in the most remarkable way. The first baby emerged red and hairy, covered with what seemed like a garment of fur. They named him Esau, which sounds like the Hebrew word for hairy. But even more significant was his ruddy reddish appearance, which would later connect to his descendants' homeland, the Red Rock country of Edom. But the real drama came with the second birth. As Jacob emerged, he was grasping his brother's heel as if trying to pull him back and claim the position of firstborn for himself. They named him Jacob, which means heel grabber or supplanter, names that would prove prophetic in ways nobody could have imagined. From their very first moments outside the womb, these twins embodied contradiction and conflict. Esau was everything a father in that culture could want in a firstborn son. He was robust, outdoorsy, a man's man who could track a deer through rocky terrain and bring home dinner for the family. He was impulsive, passionate, generous to a fault, and completely at home in the wild places of the world. Jacob, on the other hand, was quiet, thoughtful, preferring the comfort of the family tents to the uncertainty of the hunt. The Hebrew word used to describe him, tam, suggests someone who is complete, peaceful, or even innocent. Though, as we'll see, this innocence had its own complexities. And here's where the family dynamics became both fascinating and tragic. Isaac, perhaps seeing something of his own love for the outdoors in his eldest son, favored Esau. Maybe it was the fresh game that Esau regularly provided, or perhaps it was simply the natural connection between a father and a son who shared his love of adventure and risk. Rebekah, however, loved Jacob. Some scholars suggest she remembered the prophecy and was naturally drawn to the son who was destined for greatness. Others think she simply connected with Jacob's quieter, more contemplative nature. Whatever the reason, the stage was set for a family divided by favoritism, one of the most destructive forces that can tear apart any household. But let's pause here and consider what it meant to be the firstborn in this ancient world. The birthright wasn't just about getting a bigger inheritance, though that was part of it. The firstborn typically received a double portion of the family wealth. In Isaac's case, that would have been significant flocks, herds, servants, and most importantly, the rights to the best grazing and water sources. But the birthright carried much more than material wealth. It included spiritual authority as the family priest, offering sacrifices and leading the household in worship. It meant being the family's representative before God and man, the one who would carry on the family name and traditions. And in this particular family, the birthright carried something unprecedented, the covenant promises that God had made to Abraham. The promise that his descendants would become a great nation, that they would possess the land of Canaan, and that through them all the families of the earth would be blessed. These weren't just nice words. They were divine guarantees that would shape the future of human history. Esau was born to inherit all of this. From the moment he drew his first breath, he was the heir apparent to one of the most significant spiritual legacies in human history. He didn't earn it, didn't deserve it any more than Jacob did. He simply had the incredible good fortune to emerge from the womb a few minutes before his brother. But here's what makes this story so compelling and so relevant to our modern lives. Having a great inheritance and stewarding it well are two completely different things. As we're about to see, being chosen for something doesn't automatically mean you're equipped to handle it wisely. The boys grew up in this complex family system shaped by favoritism, surrounded by the weight of prophetic destiny, carrying the hopes and dreams of parents who had waited 20 years for children. Esau learned to hunt and track, to read the sky for weather, to find water in dry places. Jacob learned to observe, to think strategically, to understand the intricate relationships that held family and community together. Neither of them could have imagined that their childhood competitions and sibling rivalries were actually preparing them for a moment that would change everything, a moment when hunger would meet opportunity, when immediate need would clash with long-term value, and when a simple meal would become the catalyst for one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in all of human history. That moment was coming, and when it arrived, neither brother would ever be the same. The sun was merciless that day, beating down on the rocky terrain around Beersheba with the kind of heat that makes the horizon dance and shimmer like water. Esau had been hunting since before dawn, tracking a herd of wild goats through country that would challenge even the most experienced outdoorsman. His water skin had run dry hours ago. His body was pushed to its absolute limit, and after a full day of pursuing prey that seemed always to stay one step ahead of him, he was returning home empty-handed and utterly exhausted. Picture the scene. This powerful, capable man, this master hunter, who could normally provide for his entire extended family, reduced to stumbling across the rough ground toward home, his vision blurring from dehydration, his powerful frame trembling from hunger and fatigue. Every step was an effort. Every breath burned in his chest. His mouth was cotton dry, his stomach cramping from emptiness. And then, as he crested the small hill that overlooked the family encampment, a smell hit him that was like a physical blow. The rich, complex aroma of perfectly seasoned stew. Not just any stew, but the kind of hearty, nourishing meal that his body was desperately craving. The kind of food that promises immediate relief, instant satisfaction, the end of suffering. There was Jacob, sitting calmly beside the cooking fire, stirring a pot of red lentil stew. The very picture of domestic contentment while his brother had been struggling for survival in the wilderness. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. One brother exhausted from noble effort, the other comfortable from staying safely at home. But let's pause here and consider what was really happening in this moment. Because this wasn't just about hunger and food. This was about two completely different approaches to life, two different value systems, two different ways of understanding what really matters. Esau lived in the immediate. He was a man of action, of instinct, of the present moment. When he was hungry, he hunted. When he was tired, he rested. When he wanted something, he went after it with single-minded determination. This approach had served him well as a hunter. You can't second-guess yourself when you're tracking dangerous game or making a split-second decision about whether to take a difficult shot. Jacob, on the other hand, lived in the future. He was always thinking several moves ahead, always considering consequences, always aware of the bigger picture. While Esau was out risking his life for the family's dinner, Jacob was home observing, planning, positioning himself for opportunities that might arise. And now, in this moment of Esau's greatest weakness, Jacob saw such an opportunity. "Let me eat some of that red stew." Esau gasped, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and desperation. "I'm dying." The Hebrew text here is particularly vivid. Esau doesn't just say he's hungry, he says he's dying, that he's exhausted to the point of death. This wasn't dramatic exaggeration. This was a man who had pushed his body to its absolute limit and was genuinely suffering. But Jacob's response reveals the calculating mind at work. He didn't immediately offer food to his desperate brother. He didn't show the instant hospitality that was so central to their culture. Instead, he saw an opportunity for negotiation. "First, sell me your birthright." Those words must have hung in the air like the smoke from the cooking fire. Jacob wasn't asking for a small favor in return for the meal. He wasn't even asking for payment that could be worked off later. He was asking for everything, the birthright that would make Esau the head of the family, the heir to Isaac's wealth, the inheritor of God's covenant promises. And here's where we need to understand the magnitude of what Jacob was proposing. In modern terms, it would be like asking someone to sign over their inheritance, their family business, their trust fund, and their position as company president, all for a single meal. It was audacious to the point of being outrageous. But Esau's response reveals everything we need to know about his character in this moment. "Look, I am about to die. What good is the birthright to me?" There it is, the philosophy that would define this transaction and its consequences. Esau was trapped in the tyranny of the immediate. His thinking was completely dominated by his present suffering, his current need, his right-now problem. The birthright, with all its future benefits and spiritual significance, seemed irrelevant in the face of his immediate hunger. This is the moment where we need to pause and really examine what was happening, because this transaction reveals something profound about human nature that's just as relevant today as it was 4,000 years ago. Esau wasn't thinking about the flocks and herds he would lose. He wasn't considering the leadership role he was giving up. He wasn't weighing the spiritual authority that went with the birthright. He certainly wasn't thinking about the covenant promises, the assurance that his descendants would become a great nation, inherit the promised land, and be a blessing to all humanity. All he could think about was the gnawing ache in his stomach and the incredible smell of that stew. His entire world had shrunk to this one moment, this one need, this one opportunity for relief. Jacob, meanwhile, was thinking generationally. He understood that a moment's hunger was temporary, but a birthright was forever. He recognized that present discomfort would pass, but family position and divine promises would last for centuries. "Swear to me first," Jacob insisted. He wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away due to a misunderstanding or his brother's later regrets. He wanted a formal, binding oath that couldn't be taken back once Esau's hunger was satisfied. And Esau swore. Right there beside the cooking fire, while the smell of lentils filled the air, he took an oath that transferred his birthright, everything he had been born to inherit, to his younger brother for a bowl of stew. The biblical text is almost clinical in its brevity. So he swore an oath to him selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank and then got up and left. But imagine the complexity of emotions that must have filled those few moments. The immediate relief as the warm food hit Esau's empty stomach. The gradual return of strength to his exhausted body. And then perhaps as his hunger was satisfied and his thinking cleared, the growing realization of what he had just done. The Hebrew word used to describe Esau's attitude afterward is baza. He despised his birthright. Some translations say he made light of it or treated it as worthless. This wasn't buyer's remorse. This was a fundamental devaluation of something that should have been precious beyond measure. And here's our first major life lesson from Esau's story. When we're operating from a place of desperate need, whether it's hunger, loneliness, financial pressure, or any other form of urgent desire, we become incredibly vulnerable to making decisions that trade long-term value for short-term relief. Think about your own life. How many times have you seen people make choices that seemed obviously self-destructive from the outside, but made perfect sense to them in the moment? The person who ruins their credit for immediate purchases, the individual who destroys a marriage for a momentary affair, the student who drops out of college because the work is hard right now, the entrepreneur who sells their business for a fraction of its value because they need cash immediately. We look at these situations and think, how could they be so foolish? But Esau's story reminds us that when we're hungry, literally or figuratively, our judgment becomes compromised. We lose the ability to see beyond our immediate circumstances. But there's another lesson here that's equally important. Jacob's behavior, while strategically brilliant, was morally questionable at best. He saw his brother's desperation, and instead of offering help, he saw an opportunity for personal gain. He took advantage of Esau's weakness to advance his own position. This is where the story becomes complex and morally ambiguous in a way that reflects real life. Jacob wasn't entirely wrong. He did value Seir's the birthright more than Esau did, and he would ultimately prove to be a better steward of the covenant promises. But his methods were manipulative and exploitative. Sometimes in life, the right outcome happens through wrong means. Sometimes people who shouldn't be in positions of authority get there through questionable tactics. Sometimes those who abuse others' weakness end up with benefits they don't deserve. The story of Jacob and Esau reminds us that life is complicated, that divine purposes can work through human failure, and that being chosen for something doesn't always mean you obtained it through noble means. For Esau, this transaction marked the beginning of a journey that would take him through loss, anger, exile, and ultimately to a kind of redemption that nobody could have predicted. He had sold his birthright, but his story was far from over. The smell of that lentil stew would haunt him for the rest of his life, not just as a reminder of his foolish choice, but as a symbol of how quickly everything can change when we let our immediate needs override our long-term values. But as we'll see, losing the birthright was only the beginning. The worst was yet to come. Years passed after the infamous stew transaction, and life in Isaac's household settled into new patterns. Esau continued to hunt and provide game for the family, though now there was an undercurrent of change in his relationship with Jacob. The birthright might have been transferred, but its full implications hadn't yet been realized. After all, Isaac was still very much alive and in charge of the family. But time has a way of catching up with everyone, and Isaac was no exception. The robust patriarch who had survived being bound on an altar as a young man, who had dug wells and made peace with hostile neighbors who had prospered in a land that wasn't his own, was now growing old. His body was failing him, but most significantly, his eyesight was nearly gone. In the ancient world, blindness in old age wasn't just a physical limitation. It was a sign that death wasn't far away. And for a patriarch, approaching death meant it was time to bestow the final blessing on the next generation. This wasn't just a nice moment of family bonding. It was the formal, legal, and spiritual transfer of authority from father to son. The blessing was different from the birthright, though they were closely related. The birthright was more about inheritance and material possessions. The blessing was about spiritual authority, family leadership, and most importantly, in this family's case, the continuation of God's covenant promises. It was the moment when the recipient would officially become the next patriarch, the spiritual head of the clan. And despite everything that had happened with the stew, despite Jacob's legal claim to the birthright, Isaac still intended to bless Esau. This is where we need to pause and consider Isaac's perspective. He was old, nearly blind, and probably not fully aware of the transaction that had taken place between his sons years earlier. Even if he had known about it, he might not have considered it valid. After all, what kind of binding agreement could be made over a bowl of food during a moment of desperation? Isaac's favoritism toward Esau had never wavered. He still saw his firstborn as the natural heir, the son who embodied the strength and capability needed to lead the family in a dangerous world. Esau was still the provider, still the one who brought him the savory game he loved, still the son who seemed most suited for the responsibilities of leadership. So Isaac called Esau to his tent with a request that seemed both natural and urgent. "I am now an old man and don't know the day of my death. Now then get your equipment, your quiver and bow, and go out to the open country to hunt some wild game for me. Prepare me the kind of tasty food I like and bring it to me to eat so that I may give you my blessing before I die." It was a perfectly reasonable request from a father to his son. Isaac wanted one last meal of his favorite food prepared by his favorite son before performing the most important act of his life, passing on the covenant blessing that he had received from his father Abraham. Esau must have felt a surge of joy and relief. Despite everything, despite selling his birthright, despite the growing tension with Jacob, despite years of uncertainty about his future, his father still intended to bless him. The birthright might be gone, but the blessing would still be his. He would still be the next patriarch. But Rebekah was listening. This is one of those moments in biblical history where we see the complexity of human motivation and the mysterious ways that divine purposes work through flawed people, making questionable choices. Rebekah overheard Isaac's instructions to Esau, and she immediately saw a crisis. Remember, Rebekah had received a prophecy before the twins were born: the older will serve the younger. She had watched Jacob grow up into exactly the kind of thoughtful, strategic person who might be better suited to handle the covenant promises. She had seen Esau's impulsiveness, his tendency to make rash decisions, his willingness to trade away his birthright for immediate gratification. From her perspective, Isaac was about to make a terrible mistake that would contradict God's revealed will and potentially derail the divine plan for their family. She had to act, and she had to act quickly. Her solution was audacious in its simplicity and devastating in its deception. She would help Jacob impersonate Esau and steal the blessing. "Go out to the flock and bring me 2 choice young goats," she told Jacob urgently, "so I can prepare some tasty food for your father just the way he likes it. Then you will take it to your father to eat, so that he may give you his blessing before he dies." Jacob's response reveals that he wasn't entirely comfortable with the plan. "But my brother Esau is a hairy man, while I have smooth skin. What if my father touches me? I would appear to be tricking him and would bring down a curse on myself rather than a blessing." Notice that Jacob didn't object to the deception on moral grounds. He was worried about getting caught, not about the ethics of lying to his dying father. This tells us something important about the moral climate of this family. Deception was seen as a viable strategy, not necessarily as a violation of fundamental principles. Rebekah was undeterred by her son's concerns. "My son, let the curse fall on me. Just do what I say. Go and get them for me." So the plot was set in motion. While Esau was out in the wilderness carefully tracking game and preparing to fulfill his father's final request, his mother and brother were busy preparing an elaborate fraud. Rebekah prepared the goat meat to taste like wild game, no small feat of culinary skill. She took Esau's best clothes, the ones that would carry his distinctive scent, and put them on Jacob. Most ingeniously, she covered Jacob's smooth hands and neck with goat skins to simulate Esau's hairy texture. The preparation complete, Jacob approached his father's tent, carrying the food and wearing his brother's identity. "My father," he called softly. "Yes, my son," Isaac replied. "Who is it?" And here's where the deception began in earnest. "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Please sit up and eat some of my game so that you may give me your blessing." Isaac was immediately suspicious. "How did you find it so quickly, my son?" Jacob's response reveals both his quick thinking and his willingness to invoke God in his deception. "The Lord your God gave me success." But Isaac wasn't convinced. His other senses were compensating for his failing eyesight, and something didn't seem right. "Come near, so I can touch you, my son, to know whether you really are my son Esau or not." This had to be one of the most tension-filled moments in the entire story. Jacob approached his nearly blind father wearing his brother's clothes, his smooth skin covered with goat skins, knowing that discovery would mean not just the failure of his plan, but potentially his father's curse and permanent expulsion from the family. Isaac reached out and touched his hands. The goat skins worked. The texture felt like Esau's hairy skin. But Isaac was still troubled by what he was hearing. The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. Can you imagine the psychological tension of this moment? Isaac's paternal instincts were telling him something was wrong, but his physical examination seemed to confirm that this was indeed Esau. He asked one more time, "Are you really my son Esau?" And Jacob, looking directly into his father's clouded eyes, lied again, "I am." So Isaac ate the meal that Rebekah had prepared. He drank the wine that Jacob brought, and then, convinced that he was blessing his eldest son, he performed the most sacred act of his life, the transfer of the covenant blessing to the next generation. But what he said reveals that this blessing was far more than just a father's good wishes for his son. This was a prophetic declaration, a divine pronouncement that would shape the future of nations. "Ah, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed." These weren't just nice words from an aging father. In that culture, such a blessing was considered prophetic and irrevocable. Isaac had just declared that Jacob would be prosperous, powerful, and dominant over his brothers, including Esau. He had transferred not just his personal blessing, but the continuation of God's covenant promises. Jacob had achieved his goal. He had the birthright and now the blessing. Everything that should have belonged to Esau was now legally and spiritually his. But the celebration was short-lived. Just as Jacob was leaving his father's tent, probably still trembling from the intensity of what had just happened, Esau returned from his hunting trip. He had been successful. He was carrying fresh game, and his heart was full of anticipation for this special moment with his father. Esau prepared the meal exactly as Isaac had requested, seasoning it with the skill of someone who had been providing game for his family his entire life. Then he approached his father's tent with joy and reverence, ready to receive the blessing that would confirm his position as the next patriarch. "Let my father sit up and eat some of his son's game so that you may give me your blessing," he said warmly. Isaac was confused. "Who are you?" "I am your son, your firstborn Esau." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Isaac began to tremble violently as the full implications of what had happened crashed over him. He had been deceived. He had given the covenant blessing to the wrong son, and according to the customs and beliefs of his time, there was no way to undo what had been done. Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? I ate it just before you came, and I blessed him, and indeed he will be blessed. When Esau heard his father's words, he burst out with a loud and bitter cry that echoes across the millennia. It's one of the most heartbreaking moments in all of biblical literature, the cry of a man who had just realized that he had lost everything he had been born to inherit. "Bless me too, my father," he pleaded, his voice breaking with anguish. But Isaac's response was devastating in its finality. "Your brother came deceitfully and took your blessing." Esau's reply reveals both his recognition of his brother's character and his own crushing disappointment. Isn't he rightly named Jacob? This is the second time he has taken advantage of me. He took my birthright, and now he's taken my blessing. And then, in words that reveal the depth of his desperation and pain, "Haven't you reserved any blessing for me?" Isaac's answer was like a nail in a coffin. He had given Jacob dominion, wealth, prosperity, everything that the covenant blessing contained. "I have made him lord over you and have made all his relatives his servants. I have sustained him with grain and new wine. So what can I possibly do for you, my son? But Esau wouldn't give up. Through his tears, with his voice cracking with emotion, he made one final plea. Do you have only one blessing? My father, bless me too, my father. And then the text gives us one of the most poignant details in the entire story. Then Esau wept aloud. This wasn't quiet disappointment or dignified resignation. This was raw, overwhelming grief, the kind of crying that comes from the deepest places of loss and betrayal. Esau was mourning not just what he had lost, but what could never be recovered. Isaac, moved by his son's anguish, did give Esau a blessing of sorts, but it was a pale shadow of what Jacob had received. Your dwelling will be away from the earth's richness, away from the dew of heaven above. You will live by the sword and you will serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you will throw his yoke from off your neck. It was a blessing that was really a curse, a prediction of conflict, exile, and subordination. Where Jacob had been promised prosperity and dominion, Esau was told he would live in harsh places and serve his younger brother. The only hope offered was that someday, when he grew restless enough, he might break free from Jacob's rule. The transformation was complete. In a single day, Esau had gone from expectant heir to dispossessed exile. Everything he had been born to inherit, the family leadership, the material wealth, the spiritual authority, the covenant promises, all of it now belonged to Jacob. But the most devastating loss wasn't material or even spiritual. It was relational. Esau had been betrayed by his own mother and brother, deceived by the two people who should have been most trustworthy in his life. The family that had been fractured by favoritism was now completely shattered by deception. And Esau's response to this betrayal was entirely human and entirely understandable. The days of mourning for my father are near. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. This wasn't just anger speaking. This was a man planning murder. Esau was going to wait until Isaac died, and the mourning period was complete, and then he was going to take his revenge. In his mind, Jacob had committed crimes worthy of death, and since there was no legal system to provide justice, he would provide it himself. When Rebekah learned of Esau's plans, probably through the family grapevine, since secrets don't stay hidden long in close-knit communities, she realized that her deception had set in motion events that could destroy both of her sons. If Esau killed Jacob, he would become a murderer and probably be killed in return by Jacob's supporters or flee into permanent exile. If Jacob killed Esau in self-defense, he would be tormented by guilt and possibly face blood vengeance from Esau's allies. So she approached Isaac with a different concern, one that was partially true but didn't reveal the full extent of the crisis. I'm disgusted with living because of these Hittite women. If Jacob takes a wife from among the women of this land, from Hittite women like these, my life will not be worth living. It was a clever solution to an impossible problem. By focusing on Jacob's need to find a suitable wife from their extended family back in Mesopotamia, she could get him safely away from Esau's murderous intentions while appearing to be concerned about proper family lineage. Isaac, probably still shaken by the deception and its aftermath, agreed to send Jacob away. But in a final ironic twist, he gave Jacob another blessing as he prepares to leave. essentially confirming and reinforcing everything that had been gained through deception. And so Jacob left, carrying with him the birthright he had purchased and the blessing he had stolen, but also carrying the knowledge that he was fleeing for his life from a brother who had every reason to want him dead. Esau watched his brother depart, knowing that Jacob was escaping the justice that Esau had planned to deliver. The betrayal was complete, the family was destroyed, and the future was uncertain. But this moment of loss and anger would become the crucible in which Esau's character would be forged anew. The man who had carelessly sold his birthright for a bowl of stew was about to discover what he was really made of when everything he had ever known was stripped away. His journey into the wilderness, both literal and metaphorical, was just beginning. With Jacob gone and Isaac's blessing irreversibly transferred, Esau found himself in a position that no firstborn son in his culture could have imagined, displaced from his own family, stripped of his inheritance, and faced with the necessity of building an entirely new life from scratch. But Esau's response to this crisis reveals something remarkable about his character, something that his previous impulsive decisions had hidden. When faced with total loss, instead of wallowing in self-pity or continuing to plot revenge, he chose action. He chose to rebuild. The first indication of this new direction came in the form of a marriage decision that was both strategic and symbolic. Esau realized that part of his parents' disappointment with him, beyond the lost birthright and stolen blessing, related to his earlier marriages to Hittite women. These marriages had been a grief of mine to Isaac and Rebekah, as the biblical text puts it. In the ancient Near East, marriage wasn't just a personal choice, it was a family and tribal alliance. When Esau had married Judith and Basemeth, both daughters of Hittite fathers, he had essentially been declaring his independence from his parents' values and his alignment with the local Canaanite culture. These marriages represented a form of rebellion, a rejection of the careful separation that Abraham and Isaac had maintained between their family and the surrounding peoples. But now watching Jacob depart from Mesopotamia to find a wife from their extended family and receiving Isaac's blessing for doing so, Esau made a decision that showed remarkable insight and maturity. He went to Ishmael, his father's half-brother, and married Mahalath, Ishmael's daughter. This wasn't just a desperate attempt to win back his parents' approval, though that may have been part of his motivation. This was a strategic alliance that positioned Esau within the broader Abrahamic family, while still maintaining his independence from Isaac's direct household. Ishmael, like Esau, had been displaced from the primary covenant line, but he had still received God's blessing and had become the father of a great nation. By marrying into Ishmael's family, Esau was essentially saying, "If I can't be part of the main covenant line, I'll create my own branch of the Abrahamic tree." It was a brilliant move that demonstrated he was learning to think beyond immediate impulses and consider long-term family positioning. But the most significant aspect of Esau's new direction was geographic. He began to establish himself in the hill country of Seir, southeast of the Dead Sea, in what would later become known as Edom. This wasn't just a random choice of location. It was a land that seemed perfectly suited to Esau's particular skills and temperament. Seir was rugged mountainous country, not the kind of place where you could easily graze large flocks of sheep and goats like Isaac did in the more temperate areas around Beersheba. This was hunting country, warrior country, a place where survival depended on toughness, resourcefulness, and the ability to adapt to harsh conditions. It was, in other words, perfect for someone with Esau's particular strengths. And here's where we see the third major life lesson from Esau's story. When life strips away what you thought you were supposed to have, you might discover gifts and opportunities you never knew existed. Esau had spent his entire life up to this point defined by what he was losing. First, the birthright, then the blessing, then his place in his father's household. But now forced to build something entirely new, he began to discover what he could actually accomplish when he stopped looking backward and started looking forward. The land of Seir challenged Esau in ways that living under his father's protection never had. He had to learn not just how to hunt for sport or to supplement the family diet, but how to provide for his own household in a harsh environment. He had to develop skills in leadership, diplomacy, and tribal organization that he had never needed before. Most importantly, he had to learn how to build something that was entirely his own, not an inheritance from his father or a position he had been born into, but something he created through his own effort, vision, and determination. The biblical text gives us glimpses of this transformation through the genealogies and tribal lists. In Genesis 30, these dry-sounding lists of names actually tell a remarkable story of growth and success. Esau didn't just survive his exile, he thrived. He became the founder of a nation, the patriarch of the Edomite people, the head of a tribal confederation that would endure for centuries. The names recorded in Genesis 36 aren't just Esau's descendants. They're the chiefs and leaders of a complex society that Esau built from nothing. Tabmanomar, Zepho, Gotham, Kenaz. These weren't just his grandsons. They were the founders of clans, the leaders of settlements, the architects of a civilization that stretched across the mountainous regions southeast of the Dead Sea. And here's what's remarkable about this achievement. Esau built all of this without the covenant promises that had been given to Jacob. He didn't have God's specific blessing for his endeavors. He didn't have the divine guarantee that his descendants would inherit Canaan or become a blessing to all nations. He had to rely entirely on his own abilities, his own character, and his own determination. In many ways, this makes Esau's success even more impressive than Jacob's. Jacob had divine promises backing his efforts. Esau had only himself. But the text suggests that God was working in Esau's life anyway, even without the specific covenant promises. The land of Seir became firmly established as Edomite territory. Esau's descendants became a powerful people skilled in warfare and trade, controlling important routes between Arabia and the Mediterranean world. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Edomites developed sophisticated mining operations in their mountainous homeland, extracting copper and iron that they traded throughout the ancient Near East. They built impressive fortress cities on seemingly impregnable mountain peaks. They developed a distinctive artistic tradition that reflected their unique position between the settled peoples of Canaan and the nomadic tribes of Arabia. In other words, Esau's displacement from his father's household led not to poverty and insignificance, but to the founding of a civilization that would rival Israel itself in terms of political and economic power. This period of Esau's life, roughly the 2 decades between his brother's departure and their eventual reunion, represents a profound transformation. The impulsive young man who had sold his birthright for a bowl of stew was becoming a mature leader, a nation builder, a patriarch in his own right. But this transformation wasn't without its costs. Building a new life in a harsh land far from the comforts and securities of his father's household required Esau to develop qualities he had never needed before. He had to learn patience, persistence, the ability to endure hardship, and delayed gratification. Most importantly, he had to learn to live with loss. The birthright and blessing weren't coming back. Jacob wasn't going to apologize and give them back. Isaac wasn't going to reverse his decisions. Esau had to find a way to build a meaningful life without the things he had been born expecting to inherit. And in learning to live with loss, Esau developed something that would prove crucial in the years to come: the capacity for acceptance, even forgiveness. When you've had to rebuild your entire life from nothing, when you've discovered that you can create something valuable, even without the advantages you thought you needed, it becomes easier to let go of old resentments. This doesn't mean Esau forgot what had happened or that the pain of betrayal simply disappeared. But it does mean that success and achievement gave him a perspective that pure loss and victimhood never could have provided. The man who would eventually meet Jacob at the ford of the Jabbok was not the same person who had wept bitterly in Isaac's tent years earlier. Esau had become someone who had proven to himself that he could survive and thrive even in the worst circumstances. He had developed confidence that came not from inherited position, but from personal accomplishment. And perhaps most importantly, he had learned to find his identity in what he could build, rather than in what had been taken from him. But Esau's story during these years wasn't just about personal growth and national development. It was also about learning to live with the knowledge that his brother was still out there somewhere, still carrying the promises and blessings that should have been his. Because Jacob's exile wasn't permanent. Someday, somehow he would return. And when that day came, Esau would have to decide what kind of man he had become, whether he was still defined by old grievances or had grown into something larger and more generous than his past pain. That day was coming sooner than either brother could have imagined, and when it arrived, it would test everything Esau had learned about himself during his years in the wilderness of Seir. 20 years. That's how long Jacob had been gone when the messengers came to Esau with news that would change everything. His brother was returning, and he wanted to meet. For 2 decades, Esau had built his life in the rugged mountains of Seir, transforming himself from a displaced younger son into the leader of a powerful confederation of tribes. His reputation had spread throughout the region. He was known as a formidable warrior, a wise chief, a man who could be trusted in alliances and feared in conflicts. But now, as he received word that Jacob was approaching with a large company, flocks, herds, servants, wives, and children, all the old emotions came flooding back. The betrayal, The stolen blessing, the tears in his father's tent, the murderous rage that had driven Jacob into exile. What was Jacob's intention in returning? Was this an invasion, an attempt to claim the land that Esau had spent decades developing? Was it a diplomatic overture, a recognition that both brothers had grown beyond their childhood conflicts? Or was it something else entirely? Jacob's message was carefully worded and deeply respectful. "This is what your servant Jacob says. I have been staying with Laban and have remained there till now. I have cattle and donkeys, sheep and goats, male and female servants. Now I am sending this message to my Lord to find favor in your eyes." The language was unmistakable. Jacob was positioning himself as the subordinate, calling Esau my lord and himself your servant. This was either genuine humility or careful diplomacy. But either way, it suggested that Jacob was not returning as a conqueror, but as someone seeking reconciliation. But Esau had learned to be cautious over the years. He had dealt with enough tribal politics and territorial disputes to know that messages could be misleading, and that strength was often the only language that guaranteed respect. So he made a decision that would have terrified most people. He gathered 400 men and went out to meet his brother, 400 armed warriors. This wasn't a family reunion. This was a show of force. Esau was making it clear that he was no longer the vulnerable younger son who had once wept over a stolen blessing. He was now a power to be reckoned with, a leader who commanded loyalty and respect, someone who couldn't be deceived or manipulated again. When Jacob's spies reported back that Esau was approaching with 400 men, Jacob was terrified. His immediate assumption was that his brother was coming for revenge, that the old murderous rage had been nursed for 20 years and was now about to be satisfied. Jacob's response reveals both his resourcefulness and his desperation. He divided his company into two groups, reasoning that if Esau attacked one group, the other might escape. He sent elaborate gifts ahead, hundreds of goats, sheep, cattle, camels, and donkeys, hoping to appease his brother's anger. He spent an entire night wrestling with a mysterious figure understood by many to be God himself, emerging with a new name, Israel, and a permanent limp. But most tellingly, Jacob arranged his family in order of preference as they approached the meeting point. His beloved Rachel and her son Joseph were placed at the back, where they would have the best chance of escape if violence broke out. His other wives and children were arranged in front, essentially being used as human shields. Every one of Jacob's preparations was based on the assumption that Esau was coming to destroy him. After 20 years of guilt and fear, Jacob couldn't imagine any other possibility. But Jacob had made a fundamental error. He was projecting his own character onto his brother. Jacob was the one who held grudges, who plotted and schemed, who took advantage of others' weaknesses. So he naturally assumed that Esau had spent the last 20 years doing exactly what Jacob would have done in his place, nursing grievances and planning revenge. He couldn't have been more wrong. The moment of their actual meeting is one of the most emotionally powerful scenes in all of biblical literature. As the two companies approached each other across the open ground, tension must have been almost unbearable. Jacob, despite his careful preparations, walked out in front of his entire group and approached his brother alone. 7 times Jacob bowed down to the ground as he approached Esau. This wasn't just courtesy. This was the kind of elaborate submission that a vassal would show to a powerful king. Jacob was making it absolutely clear that he was not challenging Esau's authority or position. But Esau's response was nothing like what anyone expected. Instead of accepting Jacob's submission or maintaining the dignity of a powerful chief receiving tribute, Esau ran. He ran toward his brother like a child, like someone who had been waiting decades for this moment. And when he reached Jacob, he didn't demand explanations or apologies or justice. He embraced him. The Hebrew word used here suggests not just a polite hug, but a fierce, overwhelming embrace. The kind of hug that communicates years of longing and loss. And then, as if the embrace wasn't enough to communicate his feelings, Esau kissed his brother and wept. They both wept. Picture this scene. 2 powerful men, each surrounded by hundreds of followers, standing in the middle of an open field, crying like children who had been separated from each other for too long. All the military posturing, all the careful diplomatic preparations, all the elaborate gifts and strategic positioning, none of it mattered in the face of this overwhelming emotional reunion. But what had happened in Esau's heart during those 20 years to make this possible? How had the man who had once planned murder become capable of such immediate and unconditional forgiveness? The answer lies in the transformation that had taken place during Esau's years in Seir. When you've been forced to build a new life from nothing, when you've discovered that you can create value and meaning even without the advantages you thought you needed, it becomes much easier to let go of old grievances. Esau had discovered something that his younger self never could have understood. Holding on to anger and resentment is a luxury that successful people can't afford. When you're building a nation, leading tribes, making alliances, and establishing trade relationships, you learn that forgiveness isn't just morally superior, it's practically necessary. More than that, Esau had achieved something that Jacob, for all his covenant blessings, never had. He had proven to himself that he didn't need anyone else's validation to be successful. Jacob's birthright and blessing had once seemed like the key to everything valuable in life, but Esau had discovered that he could create his own legacy, his own success, his own significance. This security, this confidence that came from personal achievement rather than inherited position, gave Esau the emotional freedom to be generous with his brother. He didn't need Jacob's submission or apologies because his sense of self-worth was no longer dependent on getting justice for past wrongs. The conversation that followed the initial embrace reveals the depth of this transformation. Jacob, still operating from a mindset of fear and guilt, tried to press his elaborate gifts on Esau. Please accept the present that was brought to you, for God has been gracious to me, and I have all I need. But Esau's response was magnificent in its confidence and generosity. I already have plenty, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself. Notice the language. Esau called Jacob my brother, not my lord as Jacob had called him, but an equal, a family member, someone who belonged, and his claim to have plenty wasn't boastful. It was simply factual. Esau had built a good life for himself, and he didn't need Jacob's wealth to validate his success. But Jacob insisted, and eventually Esau accepted the gifts, not because he needed them, but as a gesture of grace toward his brother, a way of allowing Jacob to feel that he had somehow made amends for the past. Then Esau made an offer that revealed both his generosity and his wisdom. "Let us be on our way. I'll accompany you." This was an extraordinary gesture. Esau was offering to travel with Jacob to provide protection and support as Jacob settled back in Canaan. Given their history, given the potential for conflict between their respective followers, this offer represented remarkable trust and goodwill. But Jacob, still thinking strategically and perhaps still not entirely trusting his brother's motives, declined politely. He claimed that his children and animals couldn't travel as quickly as Esau's company and suggested that they travel separately. Esau's response to this rejection was gracious. "Then let me leave some of my men with you." But Jacob declined this offer as well. "There is no need. I have found favor in your eyes, my lord." So the brothers parted ways again, but this time in peace, with respect, and with the knowledge that the old wounds had been healed. Esau returned to Seir, to the nation he had built, and the life he had created. Jacob continued into Canaan, carrying with him the covenant promises, but also the memory of his brother's unexpected grace. This reunion teaches us our fourth major life lesson from Esau's story. The ability to forgive completely is often a sign not of weakness, but of strength. It takes security, confidence, and emotional maturity to let go of justified grievances. Esau could afford to be generous because he had learned that his worth wasn't dependent on getting justice for past wrongs. He had built something valuable with his own hands, proven his capabilities through his own efforts, and established his significance through his own achievements. This is the power of true forgiveness. It's not about pretending that wrong wasn't done or that pain wasn't real. It's about reaching a place where your present success and future possibilities matter more than your past grievances. But there's another lesson here that's equally important. The person who has been forgiven isn't always capable of receiving that forgiveness gracefully. Jacob, despite being the beneficiary of Esau's remarkable grace, couldn't quite trust it. He was still operating from guilt and fear, still assuming that his brother's kindness might be a setup for future betrayal. Sometimes the hardest part of reconciliation isn't forgiving, it's learning to live with being forgiven. Jacob would carry the memory of his brother's grace for the rest of his life, but he never quite seemed to believe he deserved it. The reunion between Esau and Jacob stands as one of the most powerful examples of forgiveness in all of human literature. It shows us that even the deepest betrayals can be healed, that even the most justified anger can be transformed into grace, and that the human capacity for generosity can overcome the most painful family wounds. But it also reminds us that such forgiveness is rare and precious. It requires the kind of character development that only comes through years of struggle growth and a hard-won wisdom that emerges from building something valuable from nothing. Esau had become a great man not because he was chosen for greatness, but because he had chosen greatness in the face of loss and rejection. And that choice had given him the strength to offer his brother something that Jacob could never repay: unconditional acceptance and love. After the reunion with Jacob, Esau returned to Seir not just as a man who had found peace with his past, but as the architect of a remarkable civilization. The biblical text of Genesis 30 reads like a dry genealogical record, but hidden within those lists of names and places is the story of one of the ancient world's most successful nation-building projects. Esau, now also called Edom, due to his association with the red country of Seir, had accomplished something that few people in history have achieved. He had built a thriving society from scratch, without inherited advantages, without divine promises of success, and without the kind of supernatural intervention that marked his brother's journey. The scope of what Esau accomplished becomes clear when we examine the structure of Edomite society as described in Genesis 36. This wasn't a simple tribal confederation or a loose collection of family groups. The Edomites had developed a sophisticated political system with multiple levels of leadership, chiefs, kings, and territorial governors who managed different aspects of their growing nation. The names recorded in the biblical text tell a story of expansion and organization. Teman, which means south, became the name of both a person and a place, suggesting that Esau's descendants were actively exploring and settling new territories. Omar, Zepho, Gatam, Kenaz. These weren't just family names, but the designations of clans that controlled specific regions and resources. Most remarkably, the Edomites developed one of the ancient world's first systems of non-hereditary kingship. While most ancient peoples passed leadership from father to son, the Edomites apparently elected or appointed their kings based on capability rather than bloodline. This was an innovation that wouldn't become common in other parts of the world for centuries. Archaeological evidence from the region that was ancient Edom reveals the impressive scope of what Esau's descendants achieved. They built massive fortress cities on mountain peaks that seemed impossible to fortify. They developed sophisticated mining operations that extracted copper and iron from the mountainous terrain. They created trade networks that connected Arabia with the Mediterranean world, controlling some of the most important commercial routes of the ancient Near East. The city of Petra, though built primarily by the later Nabateans, was constructed on foundations that may date back to Edomite times. The elaborate water management systems, the fortresses-like defensive positions, the integration of natural rock formations with human engineering, all of these reflect the kind of innovative thinking that characterized Edomite civilization. But perhaps most impressively, the Edomites developed a distinctive cultural identity that was neither Canaanite nor Arabian, but uniquely their own. Their art, their religious practices, their social customs, their military tactics, all showed the influence of various surrounding cultures while maintaining a coherent and distinctive Edomite character. This cultural synthesis was exactly what you would expect from a civilization founded by someone like Esau. Remember, he was a man who had been raised in the Hebrew tradition of his father Isaac, but had also married Hittite women and allied himself with Ishmael's family. He understood multiple cultural systems and was able to take the best elements from each while creating something new. The wisdom literature that emerged from Edomite culture was particularly renowned in the ancient world. The Book of Job, many scholars believe, may have originated in Edomite territory or been heavily influenced by Edomite thought. The emphasis on wrestling with difficult questions about suffering justice and divine providence that characterizes Job certainly reflects the kind of hard-won wisdom that might emerge from a people who had built their civilization in harsh mountain country. Edomite military prowess became legendary throughout the region. Their warriors were known for their skill in mountain warfare, their ability to use terrain to their advantage, and their fierce independence. When larger empires tried to conquer them, the Edomites proved remarkably adept at guerrilla tactics that took advantage of their intimate knowledge of the mountainous terrain. This military strength wasn't just about survival. It was about maintaining the independence that was so central to Edomite identity. Unlike many smaller peoples who were eventually absorbed into larger empires, the Edomites maintained their distinct national character for centuries, adapting to changing political circumstances while preserving their essential identity. The economic prosperity of Edom was built on their control of trade routes and their exploitation of mineral resources, but it was sustained by their development of agriculture in seemingly impossible conditions. The Edomites became masters of terrace farming, water conservation, and the cultivation of crops suited to arid mountain environments. They proved that with enough ingenuity and persistence, even the harshest landscapes could be made productive. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Edomite civilization was its longevity. While many ancient peoples rose and fell within a few generations, the Edomites maintained their identity and independence for over 1,000 years. They outlasted the northern kingdom of Israel, survived the Babylonian conquest of Judah, and continued to exist as a distinct people well into the Roman period. This longevity wasn't accidental. It was the result of the kinds of values and practices that Esau had learned during his own transformation from displaced heir to successful nation builder. The Edomites developed a culture that valued practical wisdom over inherited privilege, personal achievement, over family connections, and adaptability over rigid tradition. They also maintained a healthy skepticism about grand promises and supernatural interventions. Where the Israelites often struggled with the gap between divine promises and earthly realities, the Edomites built their hopes on what they could accomplish through their own efforts. This more pragmatic approach to life gave them a stability that peoples dependent on prophetic fulfillment sometimes lacked. The relationship between Edom and Israel over the centuries was complex and often tense, but it was also marked by a grudging mutual respect. The Israelites might have viewed the Edomites as outside the covenant community, but they couldn't deny that Esau's descendants had built something impressive and enduring. The biblical prohibition against hating an Edomite, "Do not despise an Edomite, for the Edomites are related to you." Deuteronomy 23:7 suggests that even within Israelite law, there was recognition that the Edomites deserved special consideration because of their family connection to the patriarchs. Prophetic literature that mentions Edom often focuses on their pride and self-sufficiency, but even these criticisms contain implicit recognition of Edomite achievements. You can only be proud of significant accomplishments, and the prophet's concern about Edomite arrogance suggests that there was indeed much for them to be proud of. The tragedy of Edomite history is that their very success may have contributed to their eventual downfall. Their control of trade routes made them wealthy, but also made them targets for larger empires. Their mountain fortresses provided security, but also isolated them from potential allies. Their fierce independence served them well for centuries, but may have prevented them from adapting quickly enough to the changing geopolitical realities of the later biblical period. But even in decline, the Edomites maintained their distinctive character. The Herods who ruled Palestine during the time of Jesus were of Edomite descent, and they brought to their leadership the same combination of pragmatic intelligence and ruthless determination that had characterized their ancestors. From our modern perspective, Esau's legacy through the Edomite civilization offers several important insights. First, it demonstrates that success and significance don't require divine election or supernatural intervention. Through intelligence, hard work, and sound values, people can build remarkable things even under difficult circumstances. Second, it shows that losing what you thought you were entitled to can sometimes lead to achieving things you never imagined possible. Esau's displacement from his father's household forced him to develop capabilities that he might never have discovered if he had simply inherited Isaac's wealth and position. Third, it reveals that true prosperity comes not from having advantages over others, but from making the most of whatever circumstances you face. The Edomites built their civilization in country that most people would have considered impossible to develop, but they turned those apparent disadvantages into the foundation of their strength. Most importantly, Esau's legacy reminds us that there are many different ways to live a meaningful and successful life. The covenant promises given to Jacob were tremendously important for the larger story of redemption, but that doesn't diminish the value of what Esau accomplished through his own efforts and choices. This is our fifth major life lesson from Esau's story. God can work through the parts of your life that seem to fall outside His specific plans for you. Even when you're not the chosen one, even when you don't have special promises or supernatural backing, you can still build something valuable and lasting that honors the gifts and opportunities you've been given. Esau's story teaches us that there's dignity in making the most of your circumstances, nobility in building something good even without special advantages, and honor in living well regardless of what others might have that you don't. The Edomites may not have been the people through whom the Messiah came, but they were a people who showed that human creativity, determination, and wisdom can create remarkable things even in the most challenging circumstances. And that, too, is a form of blessing, one that's available to anyone willing to do the hard work of building something valuable from whatever materials life provides. As we reach the end of Esau's remarkable journey, we're left with a story that challenges many of our assumptions about success, failure, destiny, and redemption. This isn't a simple tale with an easy moral. It's a complex narrative that reflects the messy realities of human life, family relationships, and the mysterious ways that both wisdom and grace emerge from our most difficult experiences. Let's step back and consider what Esau's life teaches us about living wisely in our own time and circumstances. First, Esau's story is a masterclass in the importance of protecting long-term value from short-term pressures. The image of an exhausted hunter trading his birthright for a bowl of stew has become a universal symbol of short-sighted decision-making, but it's important to understand why this mistake is so common and so destructive. In our modern world, we face bowl of stew moments constantly. The student who drops out of college because the work is hard right now, trading future opportunities for immediate relief. The spouse who destroys a marriage for a momentary affair, exchanging decades of shared history for a brief thrill. The entrepreneur who sells their business for quick cash instead of building long-term value. The person who ruins their credit for immediate purchases, mortgaging their financial future for present desires. The pattern is always the same when we're hungry. Literally or figuratively, our judgment becomes compromised. We lose the ability to see beyond our immediate circumstances, and we make decisions that trade enormous future value for modest present relief. Esau's mistake teaches us to develop systems and safeguards that protect us from our own desperation. This might mean having accountability partners who can intervene when we're about to make significant decisions under stress. It might mean creating waiting periods before making major choices. It might mean learning to recognize the physical and emotional signs that indicate we're not in a good state for important decision-making. Most importantly, it means developing the spiritual and emotional resources that allow us to endure temporary discomfort without panicking. Esau's fundamental error wasn't being hungry. It was believing that his hunger was more important than his inheritance. Learning to keep perspective during difficult times is one of the most valuable skills anyone can develop. But Esau's story also teaches us about the redemptive power of facing reality and taking responsibility for our choices. After losing his birthright and blessing, Esau could have spent the rest of his life as a victim nursing grievances and blaming others for his circumstances. Instead, he chose to build something new. This choice to move forward rather than remain stuck in the past is perhaps the most admirable aspect of Esau's character. He didn't deny the reality of what had happened to him, but he also didn't allow past losses to define his future possibilities. He took the skills, relationships, and opportunities that remained to him and used them to create something valuable. In our therapeutic culture, we often emphasize the importance of processing pain and understanding how past hurts affect present behavior. This inner work is important, but Esau's example reminds us that healing ultimately requires action, not just analysis. At some point, we have to stop examining our wounds and start building with whatever strength we have left. This doesn't mean ignoring legitimate grief or pretending that injustices don't matter. Esau wept bitterly when he lost his blessing, and that grief was real and necessary. But he didn't remain in that place of sorrow. He allowed his pain to motivate him toward constructive action rather than destructive revenge. The third major lesson from Esau's life concerns the relationship between forgiveness and strength. Our culture often views forgiveness as something weak people do when they can't get justice, or as something that requires the offender to apologize and make amends first. But Esau's forgiveness of Jacob was neither weak nor dependent on Jacob's repentance. When Esau embraced his brother, after 20 years of separation, he was operating from a position of strength, not weakness. He had built a successful life, proven his capabilities, and established his worth independent of Jacob's choices. This security gave him the emotional freedom to be generous without feeling like he was being taken advantage of. True forgiveness often requires this kind of personal strength and security. When we're still desperately needing others' approval or validation, when our sense of worth is still dependent on getting justice for past wrongs, forgiveness feels impossible because it seems like we're giving up something we can't afford to lose. But when we've built our own sense of identity and worth, when we've proven to ourselves that we can create value and meaning even in difficult circumstances, forgiveness becomes not a loss, but a gift we can afford to give. It's a luxury that successful people can choose, not a burden that victims must bear. This perspective on forgiveness has profound implications for how we handle family conflicts, workplace disputes, and personal relationships. Instead of focusing primarily on getting others to acknowledge their wrongs or make amends, we might be better served by focusing on building our own strength and security to the point where we can afford to be generous. The fourth lesson from Esau's story relates to the danger of family favoritism and the importance of treating all children as valuable. Isaac and Rebekah's preferential treatment of their sons created a toxic family dynamic that led to deception, betrayal, and decades of separation. Modern parents can learn from this disaster by being intentionally fair in their treatment of children, recognizing that different children have different strengths and needs, and avoiding the temptation to live vicariously through their children's achievements. But this lesson extends beyond parenting to any situation where we have influence over others. Teachers, coaches, managers, and leaders of all kinds can create destructive dynamics by showing favoritism or treating people as if some are inherently more valuable than others. Esau's story reminds us that people often rise or fall to meet our expectations of them. If we treat someone as less valuable or capable, they may internalize that message and live down to it. If we recognize and nurture their unique strengths, they may surprise us with what they can accomplish. The fifth major lesson concerns the importance of building something that's truly your own, rather than simply inheriting what others have created. Esau's displacement from his father's household forced him to develop independence and self-reliance that he might never have learned otherwise. In our modern context, this might mean choosing to start your own business rather than joining the family company pursuing your own interests, rather than following the path your parents planned for you, or developing your own relationship with God, rather than simply adopting your family's religious traditions. This doesn't mean rejecting all guidance or refusing all help from others, but it does mean taking responsibility for your own choices and building your own sense of identity and purpose, rather than deriving all your worth from inherited position or family connections. Esau's success in building the Edomite civilization proves that there's deep satisfaction and lasting value in creating something through your own efforts, even if it's different from what you originally thought you wanted. Sometimes the life you build for yourself turns out to be better than the life you thought you were supposed to inherit. The sixth lesson from Esau's journey relates to the value of practical wisdom over mystical promises. While Jacob received specific divine promises about his future, Esau had to learn to navigate life through observation, experience, and common sense. This practical approach to life served Esau well. He learned to read terrain weather and human nature because his survival depended on it. He developed skills in diplomacy, leadership, and problem-solving because he couldn't rely on supernatural intervention to solve his problems. In our modern world, where we're often promised quick fixes and miracle solutions, Esau's example reminds us of the enduring value of practical wisdom, hard work, and realistic expectations. While it's important to have faith and hope, it's also important to develop the skills and knowledge needed to handle whatever challenges life presents. The seventh and perhaps most important lesson from Esau's story is that there are many different ways to live a meaningful and valuable life. The biblical narrative focuses on Jacob because he was chosen to carry the covenant promises that would ultimately lead to the coming of the Messiah. But that doesn't diminish the value or significance of what Esau accomplished. Esau built a civilization, founded a nation, developed innovative political and economic systems, and created lasting value for thousands of people over many generations. He proved that you don't need to be chosen in some special religious sense to live a life of tremendous significance and impact. This is particularly relevant in our modern world, where many people struggle with feelings of insignificance or purposelessness because they haven't received some special calling or divine revelation about their life's mission. Esau's example shows us that meaning and value can be found in the faithful stewardship of whatever gifts, opportunities, and circumstances we've been given. Whether you're called to be a pastor or a plumber, a missionary or a manager, a teacher or a traded person, there's dignity and value in doing your work well, treating people fairly, building something lasting, and making the most of your particular circumstances. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Esau's legacy is how it challenges our understanding of success and failure. By almost any earthly measure, Esau was incredibly successful. He built wealth, wielded power, commanded respect, founded a nation, and created a lasting legacy. Yet, from a theological perspective, he lost the most important thing possible: his place in the covenant line that led to Christ. This paradox forces us to grapple with deep questions about what really matters in life. Is worldly success valuable if it doesn't contribute to eternal purposes? Can someone be considered successful if they achieve great things but miss their ultimate spiritual destiny? How do we balance the importance of earthly stewardship with eternal significance? Esau's story doesn't give us easy answers to these questions, but it does remind us that life is complex and that God's purposes work themselves out through many different kinds of people, making many different kinds of choices. As we consider how to apply Esau's lessons to our own lives. Several practical applications emerge. First, we need to develop better decision-making processes that protect us from our own desperation. This might mean creating personal rules about not making major choices when we're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. It might mean having trusted advisors who can speak into our lives during difficult times. It might mean developing spiritual practices that help us maintain perspective during crises. Second, we need to learn the art of building from wherever we are, rather than waiting for ideal circumstances. Esau didn't wait for perfect conditions or divine promises. Before he started creating value, he took the skills he had, the relationships available to him, and the opportunities in front of him, and he built something remarkable. Third, we need to understand that true strength often manifests itself in generosity rather than revenge. The ability to forgive those who have wronged us, to be generous to those who don't deserve it, and to respond to evil with good is often a sign of great personal strength rather than weakness. Fourth, we need to recognize that there's more than one way to honor God and create value in the world. Not everyone is called to be in full-time ministry or to receive special spiritual revelations. Some people honor God by building businesses that provide jobs, creating art that brings beauty into the world, developing innovations that solve problems, or simply raising families with love and integrity. Fifth, we need to learn to find our identity in what we can build rather than in what we've lost. Every person faces disappointments, setbacks, and losses. The question isn't whether these things will happen, but how we'll respond when they do. Will we remain victims of our circumstances, or will we become creators of new possibilities? As we reach the end of this exploration of Esau's life, it's worth reflecting on the remarkable transformation we've witnessed. We began with a young man who made a catastrophically poor decision over a bowl of stew. We watched him lose his birthright, his blessing, and his place in his family. We saw him plan murder and experience exile. But we also witnessed his transformation into a man of strength, wisdom, and grace. We saw him build a nation, develop innovative systems of governance, create lasting prosperity for thousands of people, and ultimately find the inner security that allowed him to forgive completely and love unconditionally. Esau's story reminds us that no mistake is final, no loss is absolute, and no person is beyond redemption. It shows us that character can be developed, wisdom can be learned, and meaning can be found even in the most difficult circumstances. Most importantly, it teaches us that there are many different ways to live a life of significance and value. We don't all have to follow the same path or receive the same calling. We don't all have to achieve the same kind of success or make the same kind of impact. But we can all choose to take responsibility for our choices, learn from our mistakes, build something valuable with whatever resources we have, treat others with generosity and grace, and find our identity in what we can create rather than in what we've lost. Esau's legacy challenges us to examine our own lives and ask some difficult questions. What are we building with the time, talents, and opportunities we've been given? How are we responding to our losses and disappointments? Are we allowing past hurts to define our future possibilities? Or are we choosing to create something new? Most importantly, are we living with the kind of strength and security that allows us to be generous to others, even those who have wronged us? Are we finding our identity in our own achievements and character, or are we still dependent on others' approval and validation? The story of Esau reminds us that it's never too late to change direction, never too late to start building something valuable, and never too late to develop the kind of character that makes forgiveness possible and grace natural. His journey, from impulsive youth to mature patriarch, from victim of betrayal to agent of reconciliation, from displaced heir to nation builder, offers hope to anyone who has ever felt like they've made irreversible mistakes or missed their chance at significance. Esau's story is ultimately a story about the incredible resilience of the human spirit, the possibility of redemption, even after devastating failure, and the many different ways that a life can be meaningful and valuable. As you continue your own journey, remember that your worst decisions don't have to define your final destination. Your greatest losses can become the foundation for your most significant achievements. Your deepest wounds can become the source of your greatest compassion. Like Esau, you have the opportunity to write a story of transformation, growth, and grace. You have the chance to build something valuable, to treat others with generosity, and to find meaning and purpose regardless of what you may have lost along the way. The question isn't whether you've made mistakes or faced setbacks. We all have. The question is what you're going to build with whatever strength. Wisdom and opportunity remain to you. Esau's legacy suggests that the answer to that question might surprise you. With courage, persistence, and grace, you might just build something more remarkable than anything you originally thought you were entitled to inherit. And in the end, that might be the greatest blessing of all. Not receiving what you think you deserve, but discovering what you're actually capable of creating when you stop looking backward and start building forward. May you find the strength to face your losses with honesty, the wisdom to learn from your mistakes, the courage to build something new, and the grace to forgive both others and yourself. As you continue writing your own story of redemption and hope, in Esau's tears at his father's tent, we see the pain of loss. In his years of building in the wilderness of Seir, we see the possibility of transformation. In his embrace of Jacob at their reunion, we see the power of forgiveness. And in the civilization he founded, we see proof that significance and meaning can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. This is the legacy of Esau, not a cautionary tale about poor choices, but an inspiring narrative about the human capacity for growth, the possibility of redemption, and the many different ways that a life can matter. His story continues in every person who chooses to build, rather than blame to forgive, rather than seek revenge to create value, rather than nurse grievances and to find their identity in what they can accomplish, rather than in what they've lost. May his example inspire you to write your own story of transformation, and may you discover as he did that sometimes the life you build for yourself turns out to be more valuable than the life you thought you were supposed to inherit. The tears have dried, the embrace has been given, the nation has been built, and the legacy endures. Esau's journey from birthright to brotherhood, from loss to leadership, from victim to victor, reminds us all that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. And that perhaps is the most precious inheritance of all. Not what we receive from others, but what we choose to build with our own hands, our own choices, and our own character. This is the story of Esau. This is the power of redemption. This is the hope that lives within every human heart, that no matter what we've lost, no matter what mistakes we've made, no matter how far we've fallen, we can still build something beautiful, meaningful, and lasting with whatever remains. The question isn't whether you have that opportunity. You do. The question is whether you'll take it. Esau did. And his story echoes across the millennia, reminding us all that it's never too late to start building the life you really want to live in.